America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks for being here. Our special, Who is JD Vance? This is going to be a fun show today. We have two guests, one who likes JD and the other who is skeptical and is from Ohio and has some things to say about JD Vance. I think having JD become the vice president, first of all, it's a relief considering who else Donald Trump could have picked, right? Trump could have picked an establishment guy to appease certain segments of the whatever, blah, blah, blah. JD is not establishment, that's for sure. So that's first, okay. Then, I think he's a great pick. Goodness, if you love a rags to riches story, this one's about as good as it gets. But really, your starting point on if we should like JD or not is to look at who hates him. And we knew this one was coming, but they actually said it out loud. Here's Van Jones on JD Vance.
You know, part of the reason that JD Vance matters isn't for these kind of short-term electoral calculations. He matters because of what he means to the Republican Party long-term. This is cementing a kind of nationalism. Yeah. Now, Trump, to your point, I agree with you, he's an instinctive, impulsive, intuitive nationalist. J.D. Vance is an ideological nationalist. That's a much more dangerous virus because he can polish this stuff and make it seem palatable to people. He can sell this stuff to Silicon Valley. He can sell this stuff other places. And what it does is it locks the Republican Party on a pathway that I think is dangerous for the world. Again, the Ukrainians are now in deep trouble. NATO is now in deep trouble. Trump he could have gone with a Nikki Haley and signal to the world, hey, listen, I got to give stuff to my base, but I'm not going to abandon the world. This pick is a horror on the world stage. So J.D. Vance matters because Donald Trump is pointing the Republican Party in a very scary direction for the long term.
It's great. Okay, perfect. Awesome. Love it. That means he's a great pick. And the stereotypical part of that was, because we said this like if if Ron DeSantis was going to win the nomination, remember? We said the argument from the left would be, Ron DeSantis is worse than Trump because he actually believes the thing that Trump says. And that's what they're saying now about J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance is worse than Trump because he actually believes it. One thing I love about J.D. is how he wrote Hillbilly Elegy. And he wrote that and was a darling of the left. And then he used their money and the fame he gave them to become a supporter of and then the vice president of the thing they hate the most. That's awesome. All the reviews of Hillbilly Elegy in 2016 were these glowing reviews, and now he's a virus worse than Trump. It's beautiful. Let me address two concerns that I've heard people say about J.D. Vance. We'll do these right out of the gate. Number one, his age. He's young. He's 39. We're the same age. Well, you got to be 35 to be president. He's 39, so he beats that qualification. Wisdom, I think, is the most important thing here. I think that's what that age is trying to get at. It's trying to get something like wisdom. So I'm 39. I don't have much wisdom. He's 39 and has lived 100 lifetimes. He had to grow up a lot faster than I did. When you're 12 years old and you're having to navigate the foster care court system because of your drug-addicted mom, and you're operating constantly in your fight or flight mode your entire childhood, having to try and play 3D chess just in order to survive every day, he is wise beyond his years. So age is not a concern for me. I had someone the other day on the radio said Trump can serve as a type of mentor for him as well, and I like that. So age is a zero concern for me. Second concern I've had is the stuff he said about Trump in the past. Like, how can you support him or like him when he said these horrible things about Trump? Okay, you're allowed to change your mind about things. You're allowed to change your mind about people when new information becomes available. Do you remember the National Review back in 2016 when it looked like Trump was actually going to win the primary? They wrote a whole issue called Against Trump. And it was all these conservatives who were making their argument against Donald Trump. And it was Glenn Beck and Brent Bozell, who's, by the way, his son is now in prison for being involved in January 6th. Dana Lash, Thomas Sowell, my hero, Thomas Sowell. They all were speaking out against Donald Trump. And now they all love Donald Trump. I forgive all of them. A lot of people were not sure about Donald Trump back in 2016. It's okay. We're on board now. Trump had to prove himself. And he did. That's it. We have to allow space for people to change their mind. It's okay to change your mind. In fact, if you're wrong, I recommend you change your mind immediately. Trump changed his mind, right? We're told all the time that Trump is such a terrible person because he holds vendettas against anyone who ever says anything bad against him. And here he is embracing someone who said bad things about him in the past. Isn't that noble? Also, Trump changed his mind because Trump hates facial hair, yet chose a vice president with a beard. By the way, JD Vance needs a beard. Have you ever seen him without a beard? Very baby-faced, needs that beard. First time that someone has been on the ticket, president or vice president, with a beard since 1882, Benjamin Harrison. We're going to make beards great again. Trump doesn't like facial hair. But he chose JD Vance, so we could all change our minds on important things. I don't think that's a big deal. Here's my first point before we get to our guests. One of my best friends lived the exact same life as JD Vance. Mom was a meth addict. Dad was an alcoholic, physically abusive every night, and his life was saved by his grandma. It's just like JD. My friend read Hillbilly Elegy and cried on every page and then showed it to his brother, and his brother said, JD's our long-lost brother. We live the same life. It's not a good life. But if you can get out of it, it can make you an incredible person, just like my friend. We're going to talk, on my radio show, we're going to talk a lot about it, and here we'll do an abbreviated version about Appalachian culture. Also, hillbilly culture, same thing. There are pros and cons to every culture. There's two major pros to hillbilly culture that I think are really well personified by JD in his life and in his messaging. Number one is self-reliance. When you're in the mountains, when you're a hillbilly, you're not going to rely on the government for anything because there is no government. There's no police. The sheriff is a day's drive away, and you know him, and he's using his own truck lately because the sheriff's car broke down, and he's not helping you. So that you're self-reliant. You got your own gun to protect yourself. There's no government. No one's going to save you. It's on you, and it's on your family, and that's it. We just finished reading with my kids. We read a little bit of Little House on the Prairie every night. We just finished one of the books. It's called Farmer Boy. And the real short of it, Almanzo is 12 years old, and he's got to figure out whether he wants to take this apprenticeship with the guy who makes wagons in town, or if he wants to stay on the farm just like his dad. And his dad's like, son, it's up to you. His mom doesn't want him to do it. And the dad's like, son, it's up to you. You get to decide. You can go work at this wagon place, be an apprentice over there, and you'll have a lot of money. And you won't have to go work outside in the cold or the heat. And you'll be really comfortable. And life will be pretty good. But you'll be dependent on other people for everything. Or you can stay on the farm, and it's going to be super hard. You're going to have to get up every day, every morning. There's no breaks. There's no holidays. There's no vacations. And you're going to have to live like that for the rest of your life. But you'll be free and independent. What do you choose, son? And the 12-year-old chose to be like dad. Appalachian hillbilly culture will make you very self-reliant. But I would say the strongest aspect of this culture is loyalty. Hillbillies are fiercely loyal. It's similar to self-reliant, right? The people who you do rely on and who rely on you, you are loyal to the death for them. I'll give you an example of this. This was about a year or so ago at the beginning of the Ukraine war. And for some reason, an MMA fighter was asked about the war in Ukraine. And here's what this boy from Arkansas said.
Get your thoughts on the whole Russia and Ukraine situation.
You know, here's my first thought is I'm not going nowhere to fight none of these wars for these politicians. I'm staying at home, and when the war comes to Arkansas, I will dig my boots in the ground, and I will die for everything I love, and I will not retreat. If this country's invaded and everybody's saying, well, we gotta evacuate, we gotta leave, I will not. I will dig my boots in the Arkansas soil, and I will fight for the people that I love, for the land that I love, and the way of life that I love. But I'm not going overseas to fight. I don't know what's going on, to be honest, brother. I really don't. There's so much stuff, and I don't think nobody knows what's going on fully.
That's a man who's loyal to the death for a people and a place. And I want to talk about those two ideas coming up in our last segment here. I'll wrap up this segment, though, with this segment from Hillbilly Elegy, just to get you an idea of who JD Vance is and who hillbillies are. He said, you have to appreciate my family and my neighborhood and my community's identity derives from our love of country. I couldn't tell you a single thing about Bright Hit County's mayor, its healthcare services, or its famous residents. But I do know this: bloody Bright Hit. It allegedly earned its name because the county filled its World War I draft quota entirely with volunteers, the only county in the entire United States to do so. Nearly a century later, and that's the factoid about Bright Hit that I remember best. It's the truth that everyone around me ensured that I knew. I once interviewed Mama, his grandma, for a class project about World War II. After 70 years filled with marriage, children, grandchildren, death, poverty, and triumph, the thing which Mama was unquestionably the proudest and most excited was what her and her family did during World War II. We spoke for minutes about everything else, but we spoke for hours about war rations, Rosie the Riveter, her dad's wartime love letters to her mother from the Pacific, and the day we dropped the bomb. Mama always had two gods, Jesus Christ and the United States of America. I was no different, and either was anyone else that I knew. Last part here. Mama and Papa taught me that we live in the best and greatest country on earth. This fact gave meaning to my childhood. Whenever times were tough, when I felt overwhelmed by the drama and the tumult of my youth, I knew that better days were ahead because I lived in a country that allowed me to make the good choices that others hadn't. I feel overwhelming appreciation for these United States. I know it's corny, but it's the way I feel. JD is someone who loves this country. And not just its ideas, but the actual place and its actual citizens. And he loves it to his core. He loves it in his bones. It's one of the things that got him through his childhood was this love of country. No matter what was going on, all the chaos and madness and insanity around him, drug addicted mom, the whole thing, he could always rely that this was the greatest country in the world. Think about that, consider that compared to the left, who tells kids and who believe themselves that this is the worst country in the world. If you know hillbilly culture, you know JD Vance. When you're growing up in the chaos that he did, you know that no one's going to come and save you. No one from the government's going to come and save you. In fact, they've screwed a lot of things up, and you end up really, really, truly loving this country. I'm excited for JD Vance to be our next vice president, because with this, we're going to take a break because I want to get to these guests. He speaks not only about the problems with government, but he also has a message of get your life together. Stop making excuses. Stop being a victim. Stop thinking that your choices don't matter. Look in the mirror and make better choices about your life and the life that you're providing for your kids. That's a message that our country needs. And I'm excited for him to bring that to DC and spread it across the country. We got two guests coming up next, one who likes JD and one who has some concerns. We'll speak with both of them next right here on the First TV.
And I cannot stand Trump because I think he's a fraud. Well, I think he's a total fraud that is exploiting these people, who is a total fraud.
I agree with you on Trump because I don't think that he's the person. I don't think he actually cares about folks.
But I think that I'm going to vote for third party because I can't stomach Trump. I think that he's noxious and is leading the white working class to a very dark place.
David Bloomquist is here. He is the host on WTAM in Cleveland. David, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on.
I'm glad you're here. So your senator is JD Vance. You may be losing a senator. We can talk about that another day too, like who's DeWine if they win, or who's DeWine going to put in your governor. Right. But until then, what is your concern with a one JD Vance?
My concern is he's an opportunist. You just heard the comments about Trump. I feel like he reversed course once he realized he needed that endorsement to win. I dealt with him and his people continually while he was running for senator, had him on over and over and over. All of a sudden he wins, can't get a call back. And I'm not the only radio guy that said that same thing. I mean, there for a while, I thought I was going to have to file a cease and desist order against the Vance campaign because we couldn't get rid of him. Then he wins, and now we can't find him. And I've had radio host after radio host tell me the same thing, that he was always wanting on their show. He wins, and then all of a sudden he becomes a ghost. I had a Republican politician, I'll just leave it at that, without naming this individual, tell me he helped get JD Vance elected, and then he needs him to return calls or sign legislation for him. Can't get a hold of him. I mean, this guy actually told me Democrat Sherrod Brown does more for him and doesn't want any attention for it than his own Republican senator. So I just see him as an opportunist. And the other problem I have here is, what does JD Vance bring to the table that Trump doesn't already have? I mean, I can remember in history class going all the way back to 6th grade, I was always told you pick a VP from preferably a swing state or somebody who can bring you votes that you yourself cannot get. Who does JD Vance bring? Some people will say, well, the younger vote. I don't know about that, but I mean, he's pretty much lined up the same way Trump is. He's not going to bring any more female voters. I mean, that's the one demo that Trump needed. And I just think I just don't know what this pick brings to the table other than a continuation of Trump's ideals and policies. Plus, okay, let's throw this in here. Let me throw one more. Okay, Trump is 78. 78-year-olds die every day. I mean, of natural causes. And people will say, oh, well, he's healthy, he looks good. Healthy 78-year-olds die every day. Why? Because they're 78. That is old. So if something, God forbid, would happen to him, you got a guy who has been a senator for a year and a half and wrote Hillbilly Elegy, and that's qualifying for president material. I don't like the pick.
Okay, let's work backwards from all this. So, the doesn't get a call back. I've heard that before as well. Hard to reach. I appreciate how you brought up the other example of the lawmaker, perhaps it being difficult for him to get in touch too. That way it's not just like radio bookers having a tough time. Right. What do you get from that? And could it be explained simply as his press secretary stinks at their job and doesn't communicate well? Or do you take that to the next level?
I mean, it could be, but it's not just me. It's many people. And look, I'm not sitting there saying he has to call Bloom Daddy in Cleveland back as some sort of, me being righteous here. I'm just saying that when you forget about the people who helped you get to a certain place, I've got a problem with that. Okay. There's a certain sense of loyalty and duty. And when you can't get rid of this guy when he's running, calling over and over, can we be on? Can we be on? Can we be on? Then he wins. And all of a sudden he goes straight Casper on everybody. He's a ghost. That tells me a lot. I mean, I try to read into people's character. And then when I had that Republican politician tell me that, I was like, okay, this is a guy who's going to use people to get what he wants. And once he gets it, he chucks you and he's moving on.
Okay. What about your argument about bringing in votes? I believe the counter would be something like Trump doesn't really need to bring in votes. His top priority is legacy beyond him. Because who would bring in votes? Like
whoever says that doesn't realize Trump lost in 2020. And I don't want to hear this, oh, it was stolen, it was this and that. He lost. He does need to bring in votes. He can't win with his base. Anybody who follows politics and has an inkling of common sense knows he cannot win with just his base. You got to get some of those independent voters, some of those Democrats on the fence. And that's where I think if you bring in a VP candidate that can help you in that area, now you seal the deal. At the end of the day, I want to win. Okay. And I want the best odds of winning. JD Vance, in my opinion, does not give the Republican ticket the best chance of winning.
So who's this voting demographic that you don't have, or that he doesn't have maybe?
He doesn't have.
So like
Black. There's independents decide elections. Independents decide elections. I don't know where they're going to fall. There's a general dislike by a lot of people of Donald Trump. They just don't like him. And that's what, Trumpers or people who are solidly in his corner don't understand. The guy could do whatever he wants. He could beat up a kid in a wheelchair and they'll justify it. But the fact of the matter is, this guy, he's hurting in suburban women. He's, when it comes to the independent crowd, some independents will say, yeah, I don't like where the Democratic Party's going. I'll probably go Trump, but man, I can't stand the guy. And I've had other independents tell me they're simply not going to vote. So, neither side can win with their base. You've got to reach out and get some of these people on the fringe. And I don't think JD Vance brings that to the table. If he would have went with look, the Democrats play identity politics better than anybody. And I hate it, but they play it and it helps them. Republican Party needs to start playing identity politics. He should have went with a female, or he should have went with a minority as his VP pick. Not only for the identity politic part of it, but you take away the Democrats' number one weapon, and that is, you're racist. Here we go again, 2 white guys, Republican Party. You know they're going to play it. And you help in the recruiting effort. I mean, Republicans have got to start doing a better job of reaching out to minorities, blacks, Hispanics, females. And you do that through who can they identify with, okay? JD Vance, is a black woman going to identify with JD Vance? Is a Hispanic guy going to identify with JD Vance? That's where I'm at.
It's hard to have that conversation because you and I both hate that identity politics so much. So it's hard for conservatives to play that game because we despise it more than anything. But your point though, I see your argument about reaching out to other people. But then there's the other argument. The other side of that is no. You need your base. That's the most important thing, is to fire up the base. So let's double down on that base and make sure we get more of the working class votes in different states, in Pennsylvania, et cetera.
I just said, though, have you ever met anybody in the base that is not going to vote for Trump? Because I haven't. Like I said, he could beat up a kid in a wheelchair. They'll still justify why he did it. And look, I voted for him twice. I'm going to vote for him again. But you've also got to be objective when it comes to stuff. And you've got to be able to, it's just like parents who say their kids never do any wrong. We know that's not the case. Trump makes mistakes. But, everybody just gets in line. And look, I want to win. And that's the bottom line. So let's do our best job at winning. And I just don't think J.D. Vance brings it. Look, I watched Hillbilly Elegy. I mean, I grew up in southeastern Ohio. His story is the story of most of my friends. Although instead of their mothers or fathers being on drugs, it was alcohol. I mean, that's no difference to me. I relate to him as much as anybody. I thought there were better choices out there. That's where I'm at. And because of the history of dealing with him, I don't trust him.
David Bloomquist, WTAM in Cleveland. Good to talk to you, David. Appreciate you.
Hey, no problem. Anytime.
Let's take those arguments, remember them, and we will present them to Josh Hammer coming up next.
My fellow Americans here in this stage and watching at home, this moment is not about me. It's about all of us. And it's about who we're fighting for. It's about the auto worker in Michigan wondering why out-of-touch politicians are destroying their jobs. It's about the factory worker in Wisconsin who makes things with their hands and is proud of American craftsmanship. It's about the energy worker in Pennsylvania and Ohio who doesn't understand why Joe Biden is willing to buy energy from tin-pot dictators across the world when he could buy it from his own citizens right here in our own country. And our movement is about single moms like mine who struggled with money and addiction but never gave up. And I'm proud to say that tonight my mom is here, 10 years clean and sober. I love you, Mom.
The best part is the end of that clip, a couple seconds into the applauding, and she says to Speaker Johnson, "That's my boy." Josh Hammer is here. He's the host of America on Trial. Please download that and listen everywhere you listen to podcasts. Josh, I want to start off first with giving you the opportunity to respond to our previous guest, David Bloomquist. He's a radio show host out of Cleveland. And his argument was that JD doesn't do anything for the votes that Trump doesn't already have, and that the base, no matter what Trump does, will always vote for Trump. But what about XYZ people who don't vote? This VP pick did nothing to appeal to them, just another white guy from Ohio. What do you say to that?
Yeah, Mike, with respect to my fellow guests on this wonderful show, I think that's totally off base, and I'll explain to you why. So if you actually go back to the 2016 exit polling and you compare it to 2020, Donald Trump actually made inroads in virtually every slice of the electorate between 2016 and 2020. He actually increased his margins, relatively speaking, with black voters, Hispanic voters, millennial, Gen Z, young voters, basically every possible intersectional identity slice of the American electorate, Mike, except for one group. The only group that Donald Trump actually lost support from 2016 to 2020 was the people who actually elected him in 2016, namely white, working class, and middle class voters. He had a skyrocketing margin, victorious, obviously, in that particular demographic in 2016. He won by a considerably smaller margin in 2020. The path to victory in the 2024 election, just based on a pure electoral college map, runs through those voters. Already, Republicans are increasingly peeling away, again, young black males in particular, but really just young voters in particular. I saw a poll just a few days ago from, it was a well-known pollster, I can't remember exactly who it was, showing that the 18 and 35 demographic right now is actually Trump's up by like 15. So he's doing well in all of these other demographics that were part of the Obama coalition. He needs to re-solidify his actual base. There's no one better to do that than JD Vance, the guy who literally wrote Hillbilly Elegy, the guy whose worldview, not just his rhetoric, but his actual approach to economics, his political economy, the guy who is constantly talking about reshoring manufacturing jobs, tariffs, industrial policy. He walked a picket line with UAW. He doesn't just talk the talk, he's actually legislated the walk in his brief time in Congress, including after the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment. He had a common sense legislation to regulate the railways a little more out of concern for the workers, the people who live there. So he is repeatedly bucking, I think, Republican establishment talking points when it comes to the manifold failures of neoliberalism and globalist economics, because, again, he has seen that with his own eyes. And last thing I'll say, Mike, just, again, looking at the Electoral College math, these Sunbelt states, Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, are increasingly at this point, again, it changes with Kamala and potentially, we'll see. But as of now, a lot of these states in the Sun Belt are outside the margin of error. Those Rust Belt states actually still are within the margin of error for the most part. The path to the 2024 election still runs through Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And I literally cannot think of a better person to do that than the one who has not only walked that walk, but since his time in Senate is increasingly talking that talk as well. He needs to go back and re-solidify the 2016 coalition. JD Vance is the guy to do it, I think.
Okay, so it's interesting. So his argument was, if you talk to any campaign advisor, whatever, you need to start appealing to independents. But your argument is Trump's already doing that. What he really needs to do is shore up his base.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So look, independent voters for the most part, Mike, right now, I mean, they view Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as essentially being as popular as venereal disease. I mean, these are not particularly popular candidates right now. I mean, they are woefully unpopular. They both have a roughly average approval rating of 38% in the 538 polling average last I checked there. They are already going to Trump in spades relative at least to the 2020 election. Again, the only demographic subslice of the American electorate who actually decreased their share voting for Trump from 2016 to 2020 is white, working class, and middle class voters. They currently have the political economy. They have the economic worldview to match. It helps when you have someone who has not only walked the walk, but is talking the talk. I really do think he's the guy to do it. On the actual math, you have to focus on those three states: Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin. Those Sun Belt states right now are looking good. It's all in right now in the Rust Belt, and he's the guy to do it by definition.
Okay. What do you make of his age? He's 39. Trump will be old. Trump is old and will be old, could die. And he doesn't have the experience to be commander-in-chief, which should be a prerequisite. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, he's the first veteran. I mean, he's the first veteran. He's a U.S. Marine, and he's the first veteran who's either president or vice president, potentially, to be there in a very, very long time, actually. So I think that is, immediately something that ought to be qualifying in a potential commander-in-chief. More generally, when it comes to JD's age, I think that is actually a selling point, not a drawback. You have someone who is, quite literally half the age of his running mate, Donald Trump, and less than half the age of Joe Biden, and still multiple decades younger than Kamala Harris. This is someone who has seen the failures of the boomer generation, has seen the failures of the people who led this country to ruinous decadence and economic malpractice, who led these moralistic boondoggles overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan, who have offshore manufacturing jobs and stripped the American heartland of our industrial base at the expense of marginally lower consumer prices because of cheaper Chinese labor. He has seen this with his own eyes. He has lived it. And at a time, Mike, as I was saying earlier, that younger voters, millennial and Gen Z, are actually already starting to peel away from Democrats to Republicans, essentially having one of our own. I mean, JD is only a few years older than me. We're both millennials. Having one of our own there to actually make the argument that the older generation has really sold you out economically, spiritually, culturally, civilizationally, I think it actually really helps there. And again, the fact that he is a U.S. Marine, I think really militates in favor of a sober and saner national security policy, because he has seen kind of the boondoggle of the Iraq War, for example, for himself.
Yes. Go about 2 minutes. Do you trust him in light of things he said about Trump back in 2016? Is he just being an opportunist, saying whatever it takes to get this job?
No, he's not an opportunist. I know JD personally. I mean, I can open up about that a little bit. We've been friends for a number of years now. We actually have a very similar trajectory. I mean, obviously, he's running for vice president and I am not. So I'm not comparing myself. But in our own capacities, we actually were both very Trump skeptical back in 2016. I was personally a supporter of Ted Cruz back in that presidential primary. But we saw the results of Donald Trump in office from day one. It was a very successful presidency. And, you know, as Trump started talking more and I started doing some of my own thinking and research and all of that stuff, you know, I kind of came to the realization that he was really right. He was totally correct about the ways that neoliberalism and globalism have ultimately redounded against America's national interests from both a national security and an economic perspective. I think that JD Vance had a very similar kind of political maturation moment there over the course of those few years. He converted to Catholicism back in 2018 or 2019. I think that probably had a lot to do with it as well there. So we kind of have similar kind of trajectories here. But more generally speaking, Mike, when it comes to someone who has his finger on the pulse as to where the American right is right now, this post-2016, post-Trump American right that is more nationalist, more populist, less wedded to abstract dogma and laissez-faire neoliberalism than the Republican Party of 40, 50 years ago, he is the guy who I have literally spoken at conferences with him. He sees it, he gets it, he thinks it, and most importantly, Mike, he has lived it. He has literally lived that life.
He's a good guy.
He's a great dude. We both spoke at this one conference in Steubenville, Ohio in October 2022. I actually wrote this in my recent syndicated column. We got dinner beforehand at kind of this hole-in-the-wall Italian place. You know, what's he doing, Mike, before his keynote speech at this conference? He downed 2 or 3 Miller Lights. You know, I mean, he's one of us. He's a dude. He is a bro. I mean, he's someone who served in the Marine Corps. He's a young guy. He's got a great, beautiful young family. He's a good dude. He gets it.
Yeah, very good. Josh Hammer, America on Trial. Listen to that podcast whenever you can. Josh, good to talk to you, brother.
You too, Mike.
I'm going to wrap up with a little more detail into his Scotch-Irish background. You want to know all you need to know about JD, hopefully our next vice president? You got to know what the Hillbillies are all about. We'll do that next right here on The First TV.
Let me tell you another Mammal story. Now, my Mammal died shortly before I left for Iraq in 2005. And when we went through her things, we found 19 loaded handguns. The thing is, they were stashed all over her house, under her bed, in her closet, in the silverware drawer. And we wondered what was going on, and it occurred to us that towards the end of her life, Mammal couldn't get around so well. And so this frail old woman made sure that no matter where she was within arm's length of whatever she needed to protect her family. That's who we fight for. That's American spirit.
That's great. That's JD at the convention, of course, talking about Mamaw. My wife's from East Tennessee. Her papaw had guns just like that stored all over the house. He hid one in a cereal box and forgot it was there and poured out his cereal, and it poured out and shattered the bowl. But that ties into what we talked about in the first segment, right? Self-reliant. No one, it's on me. I'm not going to wait for the police to come and protect me and my family. It's all on me. That's his culture. It's called hillbilly culture. Technically, it's called Scotch-Irish or Scot-Irish. Some say Scotch, some say Scott. This is all you need to know about JD. Also, worth knowing, Donald Trump's mom was born and raised in the most isolated island off of Scotland. So this all applies to everything you need to know about Donald Trump. You need to know his mom is from this remote island in Scotland and his dad's from Queens. So you put those two cultures together, you get Donald Trump. You put JD Vance in his culture and you get JD Vance. Scotch-Irish. President James Buchanan, he said, "My Ulster blood is my most priceless heritage." What is Ulster blood? There were 4 distinct groups of people who came over to America early in our founding. This isn't 1800s or 1900s immigration. I'm talking 16 and 1700s into the New World. One of those major groups were from Ulster County, Ireland. We have a map here. You can see Ireland, the northernmost area is called Ulster County. Just to the east of that, you see Scotland. This area in between Scotland and England were called the Badlands of Scotland. It was all these areas I'm talking about were very lawless, war-torn, very rough, tough place to be. Now, Thomas Sowell makes the point that if there was a massive immigration of Scotch-Irish in the 1800s, then the South would be not that much different from the North. But because the Scotch-Irish came to America in the 1700s, it was a very different group of people. These people were known, even across the pond, they were known for their poverty, backwardsness, lawlessness, violence. Life was wild, unknown, unpredictable, unreliable. Everything was about the moment because there was no guarantee of tomorrow. They were also a very proud people living in constant warfare. This group of people, these Scotch-Irish people, came to America and settled in what we now call Appalachia. When they were over in England, over in Scotland and Ireland, they were called crackers and rednecks. They were called Hoosiers. And then that name came over and was applied mostly to people in Indiana. But all those come from this area over in Ulster County, Ireland, and the Scottish Badlands. That's hillbilly culture today. These people fought all the time, rough and tumble fighting, they called it, where you could bite and rip out people's eyeballs and hit below the belt. There was a stubborn pride. A lot of cons about this culture. One of the cons, there's pros and cons of every culture. We started off the show talking about some pros. Here are some cons. One con is they're perceived as lazy. But really what this comes from is they grew up in a culture where there's no tomorrow. There's no tomorrow. There's no need to plan for the future because there's going to be a war here tomorrow. Like, what's the point? There is no future. An example of this from back in the day, in 1860, the South had 40% of the dairy cows in the whole country, but only produced 20% of the butter and 1% of the cheese. Why? Because the Germans in Wisconsin had a different culture. They had a culture of hard work, paying attention to detail, planning for the future. They built barns for the cows to live in the winter. The hillbillies in the South let their cows roam wild, and they barely made it through alive. German culture, very different than hillbilly culture. In Wisconsin, they were very attentive to detail, steady habits year-round, routine. In the South, it was just enough to live another day. What's the point of doing any more than just necessary? There may be no tomorrow anyway. There's tons of examples like this. I cannot recommend enough the book by Thomas Sowell, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. It has a whole chapter all about this. A lot of pride in the South. John C. Calhoun, he said, "No Southern man, not even the poorest or the lowest, will under any circumstance perform menial labor. He has too much pride for that." JD Vance, he wrote in Hillbilly Elegy, he said, "Hillbillies learn from an early age to deal with uncomfortable truths by avoiding them or by pretending better truths exist. This tendency might make for psychological resilience, but it also makes it hard for Appalachians to look at themselves honestly." JD Vance talks a lot about this in Hillbilly Elegy, the pride of the Appalachian people. One of JD's messages is to bring hope to people who lost it, to bring hope to young kids like he was, that, there is a tomorrow, that you can make better choices. We can plan for the future. You can build barns for your cows because there is a tomorrow. And get rid of this victim attitude. Get rid of that chip on your shoulder. No matter where you're from or what your skin color is, you can make better choices. There is something to be proud of, and there is something to live for. It's one of the points of Hillbilly Elegy. And you can also love this country. JD wrote in Hillbilly Elegy, he said, don't watch the, you can watch the movie if you want, but read the book. He said, when I was a kid, the first time I realized that there was something unique about Jackson and its people was there was a funeral passing by. And my grandma said, we got to get out. We got to stand at attention. And I said, why, Mama? Why are we doing all this? Why does everybody stop and stand at attention when a funeral motorcade passes by? And she said, because, honey, we're Hill people. We respect our dead. And JD says it made me realize that there was something very important about the identity of Hill people that both my grandma and the rest of Jacksonians in Kentucky took on. JD is going to bring an incredible perspective, life perspective, a cultural perspective to the White House. And I'm here for it. I'm excited about him. I'll end with this. I've heard and said my whole life that, and I've said this because I thought this was like some sort of like brilliant point, that America is an idea. And like, yeah, like there's good ideas about America, but it was Tucker Carlson and JD were the first two people I ever heard who made the point that America is more than just an idea. It's a real place. It's a real actual place. I was born here. My kids were born here. My home is here. My church is here. There are mountains and rivers. Like, it's a real place. It's not just an idea. The problem with saying America is just an idea is then people could come in and say, well, it's a bad idea. And if it's a bad idea, then we can vandalize your idea. We can invade your idea. We can tear down your idea because it's a bad idea. But it's like, whoa, it's a real place too. So I've heard that from JD, and there's many speeches where JD talks about this. Actually, at the convention, he ended his speech talking about how America is more than just an idea. It's actually a place. But he was upstaged by a World War II veteran. That same day that JD spoke, this World War II veteran spoke at the convention, and here's what he said. I'll never forget this.
America, people say, America is an idea, but I believe America is much more than that. America is our home.
I will play that clip the rest of my life. I will think about that clip. I will always chuckle at that clip. That's so profound and insightful. Why does this matter? So, right, you get the progression, right? So it's like, America's an idea. No, it's a real place. No, it's our home. You don't let anyone invade your home. You don't let people vandalize your home. America's our home. That World War II veteran ended his speech not just with God bless America, like everyone always has and always, right? He said, God bless our home. I bring that up because I think JD gets that instinctually at his bones, in his blood. I'm excited to see what he can do as VP and what he can do to carry forward the MAGA legacy. I'm Mike Slater, The First TV. Spread the word.